Hello, my name is Stoutjesdyk. I will be doing a paper on the cognitive bias in forensic pathology. Quick disclaimer, I do have a cough, and if I cough into the mic, I am sorry. So this was a paper published in February of 2021, and the researchers were trying to look at cognitive bias in forensic pathology, specifically among the deaths of children and the racial discrimination in the death categorization on their death certificates. In order to do this, the researchers started by first looking at all of the death certificates issued in the state of Nevada between 2009 and 2019. They looked at death certificates of children who were Black or white, and which a qualified expert concluded their death to be an accident or a homicide. They then constructed their own experiment to test this even further. They got a sample of 113 forensic pathologists together, and they presented them with a report about a 3.5-year-old child who was presented to the emergency department with diminished vital signs, who died shortly after arrival. In the report, the caretaker described finding the toddler unresponsive on the floor while in the living room. Post-mortem examination determined that the toddler had a skull fracture and a brain hemorrhage. The report further described the crime scene, the leading investigation, and the results of the medical examination, which detailed bruising on the head and neck and extremities, as well as the fractures and the brain injury. They randomly assigned these pathologists to read one of two reports. Each report was identical, apart from two pieces of information. Some were told that the child was African American and the caretaker was their mother's boyfriend. And the other group of pathologists were told that the child was white and that the caretaker was the child's grandmother. So let's get into answering the questions about the abstract. Before I jump into that, I do just want to mention some terms that some of you may be unfamiliar with, starting with cognitive bias, which is a systematic pattern of deviation from the norm or rationality in judgment. There's also pathology, which is the science of the causes and effects of diseases. And more specifically, forensic pathology is pathology that focuses on determining the cause of death by examining a corpse. Also in this, they describe the report that was given as a vignette, which is a brief description or an account. So is this the abstract the skeleton of the paper? The abstract does briefly describe the fact that they were looking at all the birth certificates in Nevada, and then also that the experiment that they did as well. It did not go into a heavy amount of detail, but I think it was sufficient enough to discuss the purposes of this topic. So they did not specifically state a hypothesis. They did, however, explain their experiment in the context of previous research on cognitive bias and the purpose for their further research in the introduction. And they did state the purposes of their experiment. The paper is well organized. Every section is clearly labeled, and there is no section that isn't where it belongs. So the experimental design is also clearly explained in the methods and materials section. It could be duplicated, and they did go into enough detail for replication. Their results are clearly stated in their results section in paragraph form as well as in table form for both their experiment and their analysis of the death certificates. The issue comes when they make conclusions about the data. The scientists concluded that due to their experiment, it was shown that Black children were given a rate of homicide much higher than that of white children. Specifically, they were looking at, so none of the participants determined the manner of death to be natural or suicide. About 78 participants ruled the manner of death to be undetermined, and those were comparable across both Black children and white children, 38 versus 40 for Black versus white children, respectively. So out of the remaining 55 participants who reached the conclusion that the death was either an accident or a homicide, it was obvious that the medically irrelevant information had a significant impact on the manner of death determinations. And in the cases where there was a Black child with they were told that it was the child's mother's boyfriend was the caregiver. Pathologists were about 5 more times likely to rule the death as a homicide rather than an accident. 35.4% versus 6.2%. While where this report that was given with the white children, and they were told that the caregiver was their grandmother, the results were the opposite, and the pathologist ruled the death as a homicide only about half as often as they ruled it, ruled it an accident, with 13.2% saying homicide and 27.9% saying accident. They did use a chi-square method and got a value of 15.9 with a p-value of less than 0.0001, which does indicate that this is significant data. And I do believe that is the correct test for this data set. So obviously, this shows that there is bias in forensic pathology, because the information that is completely irrelevant to a pathologist, hence the race of the child and the identity of the caregiver of the child, in theory, it should have no effect on the death determination of the child. However, these results clearly show that this information did have a large effect on whether pathologists considered this a homicide or an accident. The issue comes when the researchers talk about their conclusions. They discuss that these results show that the forensic pathology bias came from the fact that the children were Black versus the children were white. However, because of the fact that these researchers changed 2 variables in this experiment, there is no definitive way to determine which variable caused the pathologists to sway one way or the other, whether in fact it was the race of the child or the identity of the caregiver to the child. Continuing on to the references, All of the references listed in this article were also listed in the reference section and vice versa. All terms were properly used in their right context. I didn't see any grammatical errors or problems with word structure. Just again, the main issue with this is like question 14 says, if you're a peer reviewer, would you recommend this paper for publication? And I would not recommend this paper for publication. The researchers would either have to rerun the experiment and change the variables so they're only changing the race of the child in the report, or they will have to reevaluate their conclusions. I don't think their conclusions are meaningless by any means. Excuse me. It clearly does show that bias is present, and neither of these variables should have an effect on the determination of a forensic pathologist. However, it did. So it shows that more research needs to be done in this field to dive further into what is causing that bias and how we can stop it. All right, thank you, everybody.